They were legends, icons of a golden era. Their faces lit up the silver screen, but behind the charm, the talent, and the tuxedos, some carried secrets Hollywood never wanted the world to know. From toxic behavior to twisted power plays, these weren't just movie stars, they were masters of illusion. And the truth was far darker than the roles they played. This is the other side of fame. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's begin this list with the man who wasn't just a star. He was the star. Clark Gable, the so-called king of Hollywood. The jawline, the swagger, the voice. He embodied everything the studios wanted you to believe about masculinity and charm. But what if the man behind Rhett Butler was far more ruthless than romantic? In 1935, during the filming of Call of the Wild, Gable worked alongside Loretta Young, a young, devout actress whose career was tightly controlled by studio morality clauses. After production wrapped, Young disappeared from the spotlight. Months later, she adopted a baby girl. That child, Judy Lewis, grew up with a striking resemblance to Gable, and later, with a truth too heavy for one person to carry. Loretta's family confirmed what many had suspected. Gable was the biological father. The circumstances of that conception, and the decades of silence that followed, paint a disturbing portrait. One where fame was used not to protect, but to erase accountability. Gable never acknowledged the child, never offered support. And the studio? They buried everything. Loretta Young was left to raise her daughter alone, under a cloud of shame she didn't deserve. But that wasn't the only shadow in Gable's kingdom. On set, he was known for making cruel remarks, even using racial slurs toward Oscar-winning co-star Hattie McDaniel. He belittled lesser-known actors, maintained a cold, transactional attitude in his romantic affairs, and fathered children he barely acknowledged. Even his own son later described their relationship as distant and emotionless, defined more by neglect than nurture. Clark Gable gave the world a fantasy of strength, of confidence, of perfect love. But the truth? It was anything but perfect. What do you think? Was he a product of his time, or a man who knew exactly how much damage he could cause and still get away with it? Tell us what you believe in the comments below. And if Clark Gable sold the fantasy of the perfect man, Joan Crawford sold the fantasy of the perfect woman. Flawless, fierce, elegant. She was Hollywood royalty in Diamonds and Danger. A star who demanded attention and obedience. But behind the furs and the face powder was someone far more chilling. For decades, Crawford maintained her image as a self-made icon, rising from poverty to stardom through sheer will. She won awards, broke barriers, and mastered reinvention. But it wasn't until her adopted daughter, Christina, published the shocking memoir Mommy Dearest that the world got a glimpse of the woman behind the mirror. What Christina revealed wasn't just strict parenting, it was a home ruled by fear. According to her, Joan punished with wire hangers, starved her children for petty reasons, dragged them out of bed for midnight rage fits, and beat them until they bled. All while keeping up a flawless public image. Crawford, she claimed, was obsessed with control, status, and appearances. The children weren't family, they were props. Accessories in her lifelong performance as the perfect mother. And here's the twisted part. No one believed Christina. Not at first. Hollywood rushed to defend Joan's legacy. Studios, co-stars, even journalists dismissed the book as fiction. But over time, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Her other children later confirmed parts of the abuse. Former staff described her mood swings and her cruelty in private. And the deeper people looked, the more disturbing her legacy became. This wasn't just a strict parent with ambition, it was a woman who weaponized motherhood, built a kingdom on fear, and made sure no one dared speak out. Joan Crawford wanted to be remembered as eternal, and she was. Just not for the reasons she'd hoped. So what do you think? Was Mommy Dearest an act of revenge, or the only way the truth could survive? Next on the list is Errol Flynn, the original Hollywood bad boy. He was bold, devilishly handsome, and carved his name into cinema history, with sword fights, smirks, and seductive glances. But the wild charm he projected on screen wasn't just an act. It was a reflection of a private life drenched in recklessness, excess, and cold disregard for consequence. Flynn was the man every man wanted to be, and the man many women were told to avoid. His off-screen behavior quickly became infamous, not for petty tantrums or ego, but for a string of scandals that reached courts, newspapers, and whispered conversations across Hollywood. In 1942, Flynn was put on trial after two young women came forward, alleging deeply troubling experiences behind closed doors. The case became a media circus, not because of justice, but because of Flynn's celebrity. He was acquitted, thanks in part to a defense team funded by the studio, a sympathetic press, and a jury dazzled by his fame. But inside the industry, many believed the court of public opinion had been bought, and that the truth would never see the light of day. Flynn's reputation didn't recover so much as it was rebranded. He leaned into the image of the rogue, playing up his naughty boy persona to distract from what critics described as patterns of exploitation and entitlement. Those close to him described a man with no moral compass, who bragged openly about his conquests and laughed off consequences. He was known to surround himself with much younger companions, exploit power imbalances, and use his stardom as a shield from scrutiny. As he aged, the roles stopped coming, but the darkness didn't fade. He became erratic, paranoid, and deeply self-destructive. His final years were marked by physical collapse and financial ruin, while his legacy remained split between silver screen glory and an undeniable stain. Flynn wasn't just a cautionary tale of fame gone wild. He was proof that in old Hollywood, image could erase almost anything, except the truth history eventually uncovers. He built a career playing heroes, men of honor, rebels with conscience, warriors who stood for what was right. But Kirk Douglas's real-life legacy is far more complicated and far harder to admire. Behind the steely gaze and square jaw was a man obsessed with power, not just over scripts or studios, but over people. He was known for his ambition, his rage, and his need to control every aspect of his environment. Co-stars feared him, directors clashed with him, and writers often found their voices erased in service of his ego. But perhaps the most disturbing part of his story emerged only after his death. In recent years, multiple sources, including family members and biographers, have pointed to a long-whispered incident involving Douglas and a young actress named Natalie Wood. The story is haunting. At the time, Wood was still a teenager. She was allegedly invited to Douglas's hotel room during the height of his fame. What happened there remained a secret for decades, not because it didn't matter, but because no one in power wanted it to. The account resurfaced publicly in 2021 when Wood's sister named Douglas in a memoir as the man involved in a traumatic event Natalie had carried with her for life. There was no investigation, no confrontation, only silence, the kind Hollywood perfected when protecting its icons. Douglas never spoke about it. His image remained intact, carefully managed by a studio system that knew how to bury skeletons in well-furnished closets. Even outside that shadow, Douglas had a long history of abuse, verbal and emotional, especially toward those he deemed beneath him. He was infamous for pushing directors out of projects, including the original director of Spartacus, whom he fired within days to take control of the film. He manipulated scripts, overruled creative decisions, and reshaped entire productions around his own presence. What made Kirk Douglas so dangerous wasn't just what he did. It was how easily the machine around him kept it all out of sight. He played revolutionaries and martyrs, but off-screen, he was the kind of man his characters were supposed to fight against. He made the world laugh without saying a word. Charlie Chaplin, the little tramp with the big heart. A pioneer, a genius, a symbol of silent era charm. But behind the camera, his silence hid far more than punchlines. On screen, he was whimsical, vulnerable, and full of childlike wonder. But off-screen, Chaplin crafted an image with just as much care, an illusion of harmless brilliance that shielded him from accountability for years. And once you peel back the layers, the picture becomes a lot darker. Chaplin was a master of control, not just over his films, but over people. He had a well-documented pattern of pursuing romantic relationships with teenage girls, young, inexperienced, and often under his professional influence. Out of his 4 marriages, 3 began when the girls were underage. Lita Gray was just 16 when she became pregnant with his child. To avoid scandal, Chaplin rushed into a secret marriage, but it backfired spectacularly. The ensuing divorce papers revealed a man with an explosive temper, obsessive jealousy, and a disturbing ability to manipulate those closest to him. Studios scrambled, lawyers stepped in, settlements were signed, but nothing stopped him. Because for Chaplin, genius was always the excuse, and the world kept buying it. In 1943, a new scandal broke. An aspiring actress accused him of seducing her under false promises. This time, it wasn't just tabloid fodder. The FBI got involved. John Edgar Hoover launched an investigation, casting Chaplin as a threat to American morality. But beneath the politics, one fact remained. Chaplin's pattern of behavior was no longer something the world could laugh off. He left America in 1952, called it artistic exile. But maybe it was something closer to an escape. Chaplin gave us timeless comedy, that's undeniable. But how do we reconcile the artist with the man? Can we still celebrate the work when the silence behind it hurts so many? Maybe that's the hardest question of all. And now it's your turn. Where do you draw the line? Bing Crosby wasn't just a singer. He was America's comfort blanket. The voice that soothed a nation through war, hardship, and every Christmas since 1942. He was elegance, ease, and warmth. At least, that's how the world remembers him. But his children remember something else entirely. Behind the crooning and charm was a man who ran his home like a barracks, strict, silent, and saturated with fear. His public image was one of moral uprightness and devotion. Privately, he was a cold disciplinarian who ruled not through love, but control. Gary Crosby, his eldest son, shattered the fantasy in his 1983 memoir, Going My Own Way. In it, he described a childhood ruled by intimidation, where even a slouched posture or a missed note at the dinner table could provoke humiliation or worse. According to Gary, punishments were often physical, yes, but the emotional brutality cut deeper. Praise was rare. Love had conditions. There was no safety in softness, only pressure to perform. To the world, Bing was the ideal father figure. To his children, he was a ghost with power, present in body but absent in heart. And Gary wasn't alone. Other Crosby children later confirmed the accounts of emotional coldness, psychological manipulation, and suffocating expectations. Dennis and Lindsay Crosby both suffered from severe depression and substance abuse. Lindsay died by suicide in 1989. Decades later, Dennis followed the same path. The shadows of their childhood followed them long after their father's golden baritone faded from the radio. Some tried to excuse Bing's behavior, claiming it was a product of his generation, a man molded by old-fashioned values and hard discipline. But the pain in his children's voices, the destruction in their lives, paints a different picture. This wasn't discipline. This was damage. Bing Crosby sang about peace on earth, but inside his home, peace was a performance. And the applause came at a cost his children were left to pay alone. Marlon Brando wasn't just an actor. He was a revolution, the man who tore down old Hollywood and rebuilt it in raw nerve and broken silence. He mumbled, he seethed, he smoldered, and he changed the craft of acting forever. But just as he pushed boundaries on screen, he crossed many more off it, and not in ways that deserve applause. Brando was a force of nature, untamed, charismatic, and wildly unpredictable. He was magnetic, and he knew it. Those closest to him often spoke of a man who played with emotions the way a director plays with light, to manipulate, to dominate, to control the scene. Lovers described him as distant, cruel, and emotionally reckless. Friends called him brilliant and impossible. Even his children would later share stories of abandonment, coldness, and damage done in the name of freedom. But the most haunting chapter came in 1972, during the filming of Last Tango in Paris. The film, directed by Bernardo Bertolucci and co-starring 19-year-old Maria Schneider, was already controversial for its explicit themes. But years later, Schneider would reveal that one of its most disturbing scenes had not been in the script, and that she had not been told what would happen. She said she felt violated, humiliated, and utterly powerless in that moment, not just by the director, but by Brando himself. Brando never apologized. In interviews, he spoke of the scene with a strange detachment, calling it real, necessary, artistic. He seemed untouched by the emotional toll it left behind. To him, art was above ethics. The performance was worth the pain, even if the pain wasn't his to feel. Beyond that infamous moment, Brando's personal life was a string of emotional wreckage. Broken relationships, neglected children, and a household plagued by tragedy. His son Christian was convicted of manslaughter. His daughter Cheyenne died by suicide. The Brando estate, once a paradise, became a symbol of everything he couldn't fix or refuse to. Marlon Brando was a master of human complexity on film, but off-screen his complexity wasn't art, it was damage, masked in genius and sealed with silence. In the early years of Hollywood, not all villains wore makeup. Some just showed up to set, smiled for the camera, and saved their cruelty for when the director yelled, "Cut." Wallace Beery was one of the most bankable stars of the 1930s, a stocky, brooding presence who played lovable losers, washed-up boxers, and tough but tender father figures. But there was nothing tender about the way he treated people around him. Beery wasn't just temperamental, he was feared. He built his reputation not on kindness or generosity, but on intimidation. His method was simple: dominate the space, silence the weak, and remind everyone who held the most power in the room. It didn't matter if the target was a struggling co-star or a terrified child. Especially not a child. In 1931, Beery starred in The Champ alongside Jackie Cooper, a 9-year-old prodigy whose performance would move millions to tears. But what audiences didn't see was how Beery pushed Cooper behind the scenes, emotionally and physically. Cooper would later recount in his memoir that Beery mocked him between takes, disrupted his concentration, and in one unforgettable moment, slapped him across the face just before a crying scene. Not as direction, but as cruelty. The camera rolled. Cooper wept. Beery stayed silent. The result? A performance so raw it earned Beery an Oscar nomination. But for Cooper, that scene wasn't acting. It was exploitation captured on film and rewarded. And it wasn't an isolated case. Industry accounts painted Beery as a serial bully, someone who thrived on fear, especially when dealing with actors lower in the hierarchy. If they were inexperienced, quiet, or too polite to resist, he pounced. Adult co-stars described him as verbally abusive and deeply manipulative. Crews dreaded working with him. But the studios kept casting him, because cruelty didn't matter if the box office paid for it. Even MGM, one of the most image-conscious studios of the era, quietly cleaned up his messes. They had too much riding on Beery's draw to let a few bruised egos or children get in the way. Wallace Beery didn't just act in roles of broken men, he broke people. And in a town built on illusion, his darkness was simply repackaged as grit. Few stars burned as brightly or as early as Mickey Rooney. He was America's sweetheart before the term existed. A teenage dynamo with a piano, a smile, and a box office streak that left giants in the dust. But behind the jokes and musical numbers, there was a very different Mickey Rooney, one that never made it into the studio press kits. Rooney wasn't just a child star. He was a phenomenon, and with that came a dangerous sense of entitlement. As he aged, the charm wore thin, but the ego remained. He became known not for his professionalism, but for his impatience, arrogance, and hostility behind the scenes. The most troubling stories come from those who worked with him at their most vulnerable. In 1944, Rooney starred in National Velvet alongside a 12-year-old Elizabeth Taylor. The film launched Taylor into stardom. But for her, working with Rooney was far from a fairy tale. According to multiple accounts, Rooney treated her not as a co-star, but as an annoyance. He reportedly made inappropriate jokes, dismissed her talent, and bragged that she'd be forgotten in a few years. After her rise to fame, he continued to speak of her with condescension, publicly claiming he never thought she'd make it, and privately referring to her in terms unrepeatable in polite company. Taylor herself never confronted him directly, but those close to her recalled how deeply his words affected her during her formative years. And Elizabeth wasn't the only one. Rooney developed a reputation for mocking co-stars, especially women, and for treating crew members as beneath him. He stormed off sets, rewrote dialogue without approval, and insisted that scenes revolve around him, regardless of what the script demanded. For someone who started out as the embodiment of youthful innocence, Rooney's later behavior left many wondering what had gone wrong, or whether the charm had always been just that, an act. He spent his final years performing at nostalgia shows, often framed as a lovable relic of a bygone era. But some wounds, especially those dealt to the young and unprotected, don't fade with applause. It makes you wonder, how many smiles from old Hollywood were hiding something no one dared talk about? And now, we end this journey with perhaps the most ironic figure of all. A man who built an empire out of laughter, yet often left behind bitterness, silence, and regret. Jerry Lewis wasn't just the funny man with the rubber face. He was a mogul, a master manipulator, and one of the most powerful and polarizing entertainers of Hollywood's golden machine. To the public, Lewis was pure chaos in motion. He invented his own language of comedy, dominated the screen, and later revolutionized filmmaking by directing his own hits. But behind that whirlwind of energy was a man obsessed with control. On set, he was infamous for micromanaging everyone, from lighting to wardrobe to lines he didn't write. He would yell, belittle, and punish those who challenged his vision. Assistants feared him. Writers quit on him. His co-stars, especially women, often left feeling humiliated. And the press? He played them like a piano. One charming quote for every cruel comment he buried behind the scenes. Lewis didn't just control the comedy, he controlled the people delivering it. He was especially dismissive of women in his field, once saying publicly that female comedians aren't funny and that they lacked the natural instinct for humor. These weren't offhand remarks. They reflected how he ran his sets, with women treated more like background decoration than creative equals. Even his legendary partnership with Dean Martin ended in flames. What began as one of Hollywood's most beloved duos turned bitter. When Martin chose to walk away, Lewis responded not with grace, but with exile. For years, he refused to speak his name, rewrite history, or acknowledge that Dean's absence left a wound he could never quite hide. And then there was his long-standing role with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. Yes, Lewis raised over $2 billion, but as time went on, disability advocates began criticizing his tone, overly sentimental, patronizing, and focused more on pity than empowerment. To many in the disabled community, he wasn't a hero. He was a showman who saw them as props in his performance. Jerry Lewis was a paradox, larger than life, but often small in empathy. He made the world laugh, but left many of those closest to him feeling diminished. And maybe that's the final tragedy of this list, that so many of Hollywood's brightest legends left behind the darkest rooms when the curtain finally fell. They were icons, loved by millions, protected by power. But behind the cameras, some left behind damage no spotlight could erase. This isn't about judging the past, it's about seeing it clearly. Fame can inspire, but it can also hide things we need to confront. Which of these stories surprised you most? Let us know in the comments, and if this gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the truth behind the legend is the story that matters most.